The film industry is tough. Some movies turn actors into stars, while others can completely ruin their careers. Today, let's talk about cases where an actor had already landed a role that went on to become iconic, but for one reason or another, couldn't keep it and was either replaced, or even more surprisingly, turned it down at the last minute. Major films usually kick off with countless casting calls. When a studio puts out a call, hordes of obscure actors rush to its doors, each believing they've got what it takes. That's exactly what happened before Bryan Singer's X-Men went into production. When the studio called, a crowd showed up, flailing their arms, legs, and anything else they could in front of the directors and producers. Eventually, tired of watching endless auditions, the studio and Singer decided to give the role of Wolverine to Doug Ray Scott, who was quickly gaining popularity at the time. And not just decided, they officially cast him, gave him a chair with his name on it, and sent him off to practice spinning kicks, which he did. Everyone was happy, including Doug Ray Scott. That says a lot because at the time, neither Singer nor the 20th Century Fox executives had much faith in the film or expected it to be a major box office hit. Scott's career, on the other hand, was on the rise. In the previous 2 years, he had starred in the box office hit Ever After: A Cinderella Story, the blockbuster Deep Impact, and was busy chasing Tom Cruise in the sequel to John Woo's Mission Impossible. Hugh Jackman owes his entire career to that movie. The problem was, the start of X-Men's production overlapped with the delayed filming of Mission Impossible 2. While waiting for Doug Ray Scott, Bryan Singer spent almost 4 weeks shooting scenes that didn't involve Wolverine. But John Woo simply wouldn't let go of his main villain. Maybe they were running short on doves, or maybe Tom Cruise was struggling with a motorcycle scene, but the shoot dragged on, and Fox had to break Scott's contract. Ironically, Scott was also a frontrunner for the role of James Bond, but at the last moment, amid all the buzz around the contenders, Daniel Craig suddenly pulled ahead. How he managed to do that remains a mystery. It's unlikely that Doug Ray would have gotten the role of Bond if he had played Logan and X-Men had taken off, as it eventually did. But if that had happened, he'd probably be one of the most famous actors today. Just one franchise would have been enough. Instead, thanks to John Woo and his doves, Doug Ray Scott ended up playing a forgettable villain in Taken 3. Anyway, after 4 weeks of shooting and dropping Scott, Singer finally remembered a then unknown actor named Hugh Jackman, who had been rejected at auditions despite doing his best to impress everyone. And even then, they only remembered him after Russell Crowe declined the role, thinking it was a step backward, and Edward Norton, who was interested but couldn't commit due to other projects. Rumor has it the role was also offered to Mel Gibson, but he asked for such an enormous paycheck that the producers backed off immediately. It's obvious from the film that Hugh Jackman wasn't fully prepared for the role. His physique noticeably changes from scene to scene. Rumor has it he pushed himself so hard trying to bulk up that he nearly collapsed. The studio even brought in a doctor to monitor his rapid transformation. We'll never know what Wolverine would have looked like with Doug Ray Scott in the role, but the fact that Jackman almost missed out makes the whole thing kind of amusing. Few people know that the iconic treasure hunter, protector of ancient artifacts, and lively archaeologist Indiana Jones could have had a different face, even though Harrison Ford was director Steven Spielberg's first choice. However, George Lucas, a close friend of Spielberg and producer of the Indiana Jones films, quickly dismissed the idea. Not because he didn't like Ford, quite the opposite. He just didn't want the press to label Ford as Lucas's favorite, someone getting all the roles just because they were buddies. Since Spielberg valued Lucas's opinion, they advised Ford to look elsewhere and started looking for someone similar. The casting process was brutal. Candidates were rejected one after another because Spielberg always found something he didn't like. According to rumors, he did this on purpose, hoping Lucas would eventually give up and agree to hire Ford. Besides, it was clear that George wasn't impressed with anyone either. Despite Spielberg's efforts, Lucas finally picked his Indiana. The producer's choice fell on Tom Selleck, best known from the TV shows Magnum P.I. and Friends, where he played Monica Geller's mustached, cigar-smoking boyfriend. And it's thanks to Magnum P.I. that we ended up with the Indiana Jones we know today. Just a couple of weeks before filming Raiders of the Lost Ark began, Tom Selleck ran into a scheduling conflict. He had already signed on for Magnum P.I. Surprisingly, Selleck still had a choice. Even though he had committed to the show before Indiana Jones, he could have backed out to join Spielberg's film. Today, knowing how iconic the films became, he'd probably make a different decision. But back then, things looked very different. Magnum P.I. was expected to be a huge hit on TV, with Selleck in the lead. Indiana Jones, on the other hand, was a wild card. A film about a guy chasing a mysterious chest while being pursued by Nazis? What's more, Selleck's paycheck for Magnum was several times larger than what he would have earned for Indiana Jones. Selleck later said it was the hardest decision he had ever made, and that he talked to everyone who could offer advice. In the end, he chose the series. It's not like the choice was a disaster or ruined his career, but he did become typecast as the Detective Magnum. The series ran for 8 seasons and earned Tom Selleck a Golden Globe in 1985. Since Selleck backed out just a couple of weeks before filming began, there was no time for another casting call, so Lucas agreed to hire Ford, who'd been crossing his fingers and eagerly waiting for the chance to work with Spielberg. Here's another funny detail. Just a week after Selleck turned down the role and flew to Hawaii to film his series, the Magnum production was postponed for several months. Filming didn't start until fall. Around the same time, Raiders of the Lost Ark's final scenes were being shot nearby, on these same Hawaiian islands. One thing's certain, if things had gone differently, Indiana Jones would have been a completely different film. Still, unlike many actors in similar situations, Tom Selleck doesn't have much to regret. After all, he starred in a series that became a cult classic in America, and fate eventually brought Selleck and Ford together in another adventure project, and to be fair, the result was great. Back to the Future could have been a very different film too. That's because Michael J. Fox, despite being the top choice of both director Robert Zemeckis and producer Steven Spielberg, had to step away from the project due to his commitment to the TV series Family Ties. The show's producers flat out refused to let him go, fearing that working on a big movie would spoil him and make him put less effort into their show. In other words, they were afraid he'd start slacking off. At the time, Spielberg hadn't yet earned the legendary status he would gain in the 90s, and Zemeckis only had Romancing the Stone under his belt. As a result, they couldn't convince Fox to take the role and didn't feel like fighting for an unknown actor. So Paramount, the studio behind Family Ties, shut the door on them. The producers held another casting and spotted Eric Stoltz. They quickly signed him and got him ready for production, but when filming began, things didn't go as planned. There are 2 versions of what went wrong. One claims Eric Stoltz was too serious for the comedic tone of the film. Those scenes stopped being funny because Stoltz came off more like a tough guy than the average American teenager Spielberg and Zemeckis had in mind. Another version says Stoltz clashed with Spielberg. Such conflicts weren't unheard of. Everyone's heard the rumor about the Transformers actress who was replaced after one careless remark allegedly on Spielberg's order. The official story, however, is that Stoltz appeared too serious in some scenes, too heroic in others, and too stiff in the rest. Anyway, after a full month of filming, Spielberg and Zemeckis gave up, paid Stoltz off, and let him go. $4 million and a month of work went down the drain, although some of his footage was kept in the final cut. After that, they rushed back to Fox and agreed to whatever terms the Family Ties producers demanded. Rumor has it George Lucas helped seal the deal. By that time, Lucas had enough influence to persuade the Family Ties crew to accept an offer they couldn't refuse. Thanks to that, Michael J. Fox was finally cast as Marty McFly, but it came with a price. He worked 17 to 18 hours a day, filming Family Ties from 9 or 10 a.m. until 5 or 6 p.m., then Back to the Future from 6 p.m. until 2 or 3 a.m. That's why there are so many night scenes in the movie. Either way, Michael J. Fox became a massive star overnight. Everyone wanted him in their projects, and his fees skyrocketed. Considering he won the first of his 4 Golden Globes back in the 1980s, it's hard not to wonder where he'd be now if not for Parkinson's disease, which he's battled since the early 90s. As for Eric Stoltz, although he landed a few notable supporting roles and even earned a Golden Globe nomination for The Mask, he never quite reached stardom. Today, with The Lord of the Rings now considered a classic, it's hard to imagine anyone else playing those characters. Can you picture Sean Connery as Gandalf? Yet, it was his decision to turn down the role that gave us the Gandalf we know today. In fact, the studio wanted him so badly that they offered $10 million plus 15% of future box office revenue. Connery could have earned $300 to $400 million. But that's not the story we're here to tell. The more interesting case is Viggo Mortensen, who wasn't even on the studio's radar, not even when filming had already started. As with the Gandalf role, director Peter Jackson wanted big-name actors for every part, but since The Lord of the Rings seemed like a massive gamble at the time, most people turned him down. Lucy Lawless and Uma Thurman both cited pregnancy or illness. Jackson's first choice was Daniel Day-Lewis, but being as selective as he was, Day-Lewis passed immediately, saying he only took roles that challenged him, and running around in fake ears didn't qualify. Jackson then approached Russell Crowe, who also declined, sensing the project might flop. So Jackson moved on to Stuart Townsend, a young actor who had done well in auditions. Townsend was willing to work for next to nothing. They dressed him in rags, gave him a sword, and after another look, signed him on. A professional sword-fighting coach trained him for several months. According to Townsend, it was the hardest period of his life. His daily routine involved eating terrible food, hitting the gym, and spending hours slaughtering dummies. But everyone was happy with the results, and they hoped that if the movie didn't fail, Townsend would become a star. But something was off. When paired with the hobbits, Townsend's Aragorn didn't look intimidating. He looked like a slightly taller hobbit. After just a week of filming, everyone realized it wasn't working. They needed someone older and more masculine. Jackson approached Daniel Day-Lewis again, offering millions, a profit share, and a private creative space. Day-Lewis refused again. With few options left, one of the producers suggested Viggo Mortensen. According to various reports, Viggo wasn't thrilled about it either. He didn't want to fly overseas or spend 3 years filming, a major reason Sean Connery also passed. Allegedly, it was Viggo's son, a fan of Tolkien, who talked him into it, though some say that story was a PR move, similar to what Mark Wahlberg and Liam Neeson did for Transformers and Clash of the Titans. At the time, Viggo wasn't a household name. Some remembered him as the slick villain in A Perfect Murder or from G.I. Jane and Carlito's Way, but he wasn't in high demand. Still, he rolled the dice and signed on to a risky project. Whether that was the right move is up for debate. As for Stuart Townsend, his story deserves some sympathy. His career could have gone in a completely different direction. Finally, there's Josh Hartnett, who ended up empty-handed. He was Christopher Nolan's first choice for Bruce Wayne. The studio approved, and Nolan rushed to Hartnett with a contract, but Josh turned it down. In interviews, he said it was the biggest mistake of his career. Playing Batman wouldn't just have elevated his strong career, it could have saved it after the string of flops he faced in the mid-2000s. But in 2003, things looked great for Hartnett. He had just starred in Pearl Harbor, Black Hawk Down, and the successful rom-com 40 Days and 40 Nights. Taking a risk just didn't seem necessary. Getting Batman Begins made was a challenge. People still remembered the disaster that was Batman and Robin, and many thought Nolan's film would bomb too. Maybe Hartnett heard those doubts and decided not to gamble. Rumor has it that Ben Affleck, still reeling from Daredevil, convinced him to pass. The two had become friends on Pearl Harbor. Frustrated, Nolan turned to Christian Bale. Meanwhile, Hartnett's career quickly declined. He also claims to have had a verbal agreement with Nolan for the lead in The Prestige, but once Bale became Batman, Nolan brought him back for The Prestige as well. Adding salt to the wound, one of the lead roles in that film went to Scarlett Johansson, Hartnett's girlfriend at the time. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and stay tuned.